If you're somewhere between 25 and 40 right now, and you've noticed something quietly shift in the way people around you talk about the future, you're not imagining it. It's not hope anymore. It's not even fear, really. It's something closer to exhausted anticipation. Like everyone's already bracing for an impact they can't quite name. And the strange thing is, the bracing itself is becoming the damage. We're halfway through 2026. The World Economic Forum's Global Risks Report named geoeconomic confrontation the top global risk this year. Armed conflict second. Extreme weather third. And somewhere underneath all of that, not listed but felt by almost everyone, is a quieter crisis. The crisis of not knowing how to hold all of this without breaking. The Stoics had a practice for this. They called it premeditatio malorum, the premeditation of evils, the deliberate, disciplined act of imagining what could go wrong so that you aren't destroyed when it does. Marcus Aurelius used it. Seneca wrote about it at length. And for 2,000 years, it's been considered one of the most psychologically sound tools a human being can carry. But here in 2026, something has gone wrong with how we're using it. Because there's a version of premeditatio malorum that builds you, and there's a version that hollows you out. And most people right now are living in the second version. They're not preparing for the worst. They're rehearsing it, obsessively, endlessly, running the catastrophe on loop until the simulation becomes more real than the actual morning they're standing in. That's what I want to call the collapse mindset. And I want to be careful here, because I'm not dismissing the real risks. I'm not going to tell you the world is fine. It isn't. A 2025 survey found that 70% of Americans are experiencing financial anxiety. Global anxiety disorders have increased by over 50% among young people since 1990, with a sharp acceleration after 2019. These aren't invented fears. But the collapse mindset isn't about the risks themselves. It's about what happens to your psychology when you make those risks the organizing principle of your entire inner life. So here's the question I want to sit with you on for the next few minutes. Not how do we fix the world? That's too large, and honestly, it's not the right starting point. The question is this: what does a genuinely stoic relationship with an uncertain future actually look like? Not the Instagram version, not the good vibes only performance. The real thing, the thing that holds. Let's start with what the Stoics actually believed about the future. And this might surprise you, because it's not what most people think Stoicism is. The Stoics weren't optimists. They weren't pessimists either. They were something harder to be. They were realists who had made peace with reality. Marcus Aurelius wrote his meditations during a plague, during military campaigns, during the slow unraveling of an empire. He wasn't writing from a place of comfort. He was writing from the eye of exactly the kind of storm we're describing. And what he kept returning to, again and again, was this distinction. There are things within your control, and there are things that are not. That's it. That's the whole architecture. Everything else is commentary. Your opinions, your intentions, your responses, your values, those are yours. The economy, the climate, the geopolitical order, the behavior of other people. Those are not. And the suffering, he kept noting, almost always comes from confusing the two. Now, I know what you're thinking. That sounds simple, almost too simple. And you're right that it's simple, but simple isn't the same as easy. Because the collapse mindset doesn't announce itself. It doesn't say, I am now confusing what I can control with what I cannot. It just quietly rearranges your attention. It starts with a news article, then a thread, then a podcast, then a conversation with a friend who's also anxious. And before you know it, your entire inner world is organized around a future that hasn't happened yet and may never happen in the way you've imagined it. This is what researchers now call anticipatory anxiety, and it's distinct from ordinary fear in an important way. Ordinary fear is a response to something present and real. Anticipatory anxiety is a response to a mental model of the future, a model that your nervous system can't distinguish from actual reality. So you're not just afraid of what might happen, you're physiologically experiencing it happening right now, in your body, while you're sitting in a room that is, in this moment, completely safe. The Stoics understood this intuitively, even without the neuroscience. Epictetus, who was, it's worth remembering, a former slave, a man who had experienced actual powerlessness, wrote that men are disturbed not by the things which happen, but by the opinions about the things. He wasn't being dismissive. He was pointing at something precise. The suffering isn't always in the event. It's in the story you're telling yourself about the event. And in 2026, we are drowning in stories about events that haven't happened yet.
So let's talk about the polycrisis, because I think it deserves honest acknowledgement before we move into philosophy. Risk researchers have a term for what's happening right now: the causal entanglement of multiple crises. It's not just AI risk or climate risk or geopolitical risk in isolation. It's the way they interact. The way a supply chain disruption amplifies food insecurity, which amplifies political instability, which amplifies conflict, which amplifies migration, which amplifies everything else. The system doesn't fail in one place. It strains everywhere at once. And I want to say clearly, this is real. This isn't catastrophizing. The World Meteorological Organization has forecast a 70% chance that the 5-year average warming through 2029 will exceed 1.5 degrees Celsius. A June 2025 study found that AI models may resist shutdown commands even at the cost of human welfare. These are serious researchers, serious institutions, serious findings. The collapse mindset doesn't emerge from paranoia. It emerges from paying attention and then not knowing what to do with what you've seen. And that's the gap. That's the exact space where Stoic philosophy becomes not just relevant, but necessary. Because the Stoics weren't asking you to look away from the difficult thing. They were asking you to look directly at it, and then to locate yourself correctly within it. Not as the person who must fix everything, not as the person who will be destroyed by everything, but as the person who is here, now, with what they have, doing what they can. This brings us to amor fati, and I want to spend some real time here, because this concept is almost always misunderstood, especially in the self-help space, where it gets flattened into something like love everything that happens to you,
That's not what it means. That's actually a kind of toxic positivity wearing a Latin costume. Amor fati, love of fate, is something much harder and much more honest than that. Nietzsche, who popularized the phrase, didn't mean enjoy your suffering. He meant something more like, don't waste your life wishing reality were different than it is. Because every moment you spend in resistance to what is, every moment you spend arguing with the fact of the situation, is a moment you're not actually in the situation, doing something real with it. Amor fati is the decision to stop fighting the premise and start working with the material.
Here's a way to feel the difference. Imagine two people who both lose their jobs in an economic downturn, which in 2026 isn't hard to imagine. The first person spends 3 weeks in a loop. This shouldn't be happening. The economy is broken. I did everything right. This is unfair. All of that may be true, but none of it changes the fact that the job is gone. The second person spends 1 day in genuine grief, because grief is appropriate, grief is honest, and then asks, given that this is where I am, what's the most useful next move? The second person isn't happier about what happened. They're not pretending it's fine. They've just made a different relationship with the event. They've stopped treating the past as a problem to be solved and started treating the present as a space to be inhabited. That's amor fati. Not the absence of pain, but the refusal to let pain become the permanent address. Now, here's the part that I think most Stoic content gets wrong, and this is important, so stay with me. Premeditatio malorum, the premeditation of evils, is a preparation practice. It's designed to reduce the shock of a bad outcome by having already considered it. But it has a shadow side that almost nobody talks about. And the shadow side is this. If you practice imagining catastrophe without also practicing returning to the present, you train your mind to live in the catastrophe permanently. The Stoics knew this. That's why premeditatio was always paired with what they called the present moment discipline, the practice of returning again and again to what is actually in front of you. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "Confine yourself to the present, not as a denial of the future, but as a recognition that the future doesn't exist yet, and your anxiety about it is happening in a present moment that you're missing entirely while you're busy catastrophizing." So let's be concrete. What does this actually look like as a daily practice in 2026? Because philosophy without application is just decoration. I want to give you something you can actually use. And it starts with a distinction that sounds simple, but changes everything when you actually apply it. The distinction between preparation and rumination. Preparation is a finite act. You identify a risk, you take a concrete action to reduce your exposure to it, and then you return to your life. You save 3 months of expenses. You have a conversation with your family about contingency plans. You reduce your dependence on systems that feel fragile. These are real, useful things. And then, and this is the part that's hard, you close the loop. You've done what you can do. The rest is not yours to carry. Rumination, on the other hand, is infinite. It doesn't close. It circles. It finds new angles. It reads one more article, watches one more documentary, has one more conversation that leaves everyone feeling worse. And here's the cruel irony of rumination.
It feels like it's doing something. It feels like vigilance. It feels like responsibility. But it isn't producing any new information, and it isn't producing any new action. It's just consuming the present moment, the only moment you actually have. Jung would have recognized this pattern immediately. He wrote about the shadow, the parts of ourselves we refuse to look at directly. And one of the most common shadows in anxious people isn't darkness or violence, it's the illusion of control. The belief that if you just worry hard enough, thoroughly enough, you can prevent the bad thing. That your anxiety is actually a form of protection. It isn't. It's a form of avoidance dressed up as vigilance. Krishnamurti said something that I keep returning to. He said, "The observer is the observed," meaning the anxiety you're watching in the world is partly a projection of the anxiety you're carrying inside. This doesn't mean the external threats aren't real. It means that your perception of them is filtered through your internal state. And when your internal state is one of chronic dread, everything you look at will confirm the dread. Not because you're wrong, but because that's how perception works. So what's the alternative? I want to be careful not to make this sound like a 5-step program, because it isn't. But there's a quality of attention that the Stoics cultivated, and that every serious contemplative tradition has pointed toward, that I describe as grounded presence. Not detachment, not numbness, not the spiritual bypassing of pretending nothing matters. Grounded presence is the capacity to be fully aware of the difficulty while remaining rooted in your own centre. Marcus Aurelius had a phrase he returned to constantly in his private journals. He wrote, "The impediment to action advances action. What stands in the way becomes the way." And this is the heart of it, the thing that separates Stoic resilience from either toxic positivity or collapse. It's not that the obstacle is secretly good, it's that the obstacle is the actual terrain you're walking through. And you can navigate it. Not perfectly, not without loss, but you can navigate it. Let's talk about AI for a moment, because I think it's the existential risk that carries the most psychological weight right now. Not necessarily because it's the most likely to cause harm, but because it's the most disorienting. A 2022 survey of AI researchers found that a majority believe there's at least a 10% chance that human inability to control AI will cause an existential catastrophe. That's not a fringe position. That's the people building the thing.
And the disorientation isn't just about the risk itself. It's about the speed. The feeling that the world is changing faster than our ability to understand it, let alone adapt to it. Alan Watts wrote about this decades before any of this was possible. He said that the primary source of human suffering isn't pain, it's the gap between how fast the world moves and how slowly the self can integrate change. We're living in that gap right now, and it's enormous. But here's what I want you to hold alongside that. Every generation has faced a version of this gap. The generation that lived through the invention of nuclear weapons. The generation that watched the Industrial Revolution dissolve the world they knew. The generation that survived the Black Death, which killed a third of Europe, and then had to figure out what to do on a Tuesday morning. The specific content of the threat changes. The psychological challenge doesn't. And the Stoics were writing for exactly this challenge. So what does preparation without paranoia actually look like in practice?
I think it comes down to three things. The first is honest assessment, looking at the actual risk, not the catastrophized version of it, and asking what is genuinely within my sphere of influence here. Not how do I stop climate change? That's not your sphere. But how do I reduce my own fragility in the face of climate disruption? That might be. The second is decisive action within that sphere. Not endless planning, not research spirals. Actual, concrete, finite action. You make the call. You have the conversation. You change the habit. You build the small reserve. And then, this is big. You stop. You've done the thing. The Stoics were deeply suspicious of excessive deliberation because they understood that deliberation can become a substitute for action, and action is the only thing that actually changes your situation. And the third, the hardest one, is what I'd call graceful surrender to the uncontrollable. Not passive surrender, not giving up, but the deliberate, practiced act of releasing your grip on the things you cannot change. Seneca wrote, "Let fate find us prepared and industrious. She who is brave is master of her fate." Prepared and industrious? Yes. But also, whatever comes after that preparation is no longer yours to control. And the peace you're looking for lives on the other side of accepting that. I want to say something about loneliness here, because I think it's underneath a lot of the collapse anxiety, and it almost never gets named. There's a particular kind of loneliness that comes from seeing clearly, from understanding the scale of what's happening, and looking around and feeling like most people are either not paying attention or coping in ways that don't feel honest. That loneliness is real, and it can make the anxiety worse because it adds isolation to dread.
But the Stoics would say, and I think they're right, that this clarity is not a burden to be ashamed of. It's a form of responsibility. The Stoic concept of the cosmopolitan, the citizen of the world, wasn't about detachment from community. It was about caring for something larger than your immediate comfort. And that kind of caring, when it's grounded rather than anxious, is one of the most genuinely human things a person can do. So, here's where I want to land. Not with a solution, because there isn't one, and anyone who offers you a solution to existential uncertainty is selling you something. But with an orientation, a way of standing in the world that doesn't require the world to be different than it is. The collapse mindset says, I can only be okay when things are okay. The Stoic orientation says something different. It says, I can be okay, genuinely, not performatively okay, even when things are not. And that's not resignation. That's not giving up on making things better. It's actually the prerequisite for making things better. Because the person who is paralyzed by dread doesn't act. The person who has made peace with uncertainty, who has looked at the worst case and said, I can bear that if it comes. That person is free to act clearly, without the distortion of panic. Amor fati doesn't make you passive, it makes you precise. Here's the one thing I'd ask you to carry out of this. Not a habit, not a framework, just a question. When you notice the collapse mindset beginning, when you feel the loop starting, the catastrophe rehearsal beginning, ask yourself, is this thought preparing me or is it consuming me? That's it.
That's the whole practice. If it's preparing you, follow it to the concrete action it points toward. If it's consuming you, that's the signal to return to this room, to this breath, to this moment, which is in fact the only one you've ever actually had. Marcus Aurelius, in the middle of his empire's slow unraveling, wrote, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this and you will find strength." He didn't write it as a comfort. He wrote it as a reminder to himself in his private journal that nobody was ever meant to read. That's what makes it true. It wasn't a performance. It was a man in the middle of genuine difficulty, finding the one thing that couldn't be taken from him.
We're halfway through 2026. The world is genuinely uncertain. The risks are real. And you are still here, still thinking, still feeling, still capable of choosing your next action and your next orientation. That's not nothing. In the Stoic tradition, that's actually everything. The next video I'm working on goes deeper into the Stoic practice of the view from above, a specific contemplative technique for stepping outside your anxiety and seeing your situation with the clarity of distance. I think it's one of the most practically useful things in the entire Stoic canon. I'll see you there.